Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on fish welfare. My name is Matilda Antti. I am a political coordinator at Project 1882, and I will be moderating this webinar. Project 1882 is the name our organization Djurens Rätt is known for in our international work, and with effective campaigns and political advocacy, Project 1882 makes a difference globally for the animals that are the most exploited and suffer the worst. We have been driving animal advocacy organization. We have been a driving animal advocacy organization in Sweden and beyond since 1882, hence the name. And our vision is a world where animals are respected as sentient beings with the right to their own lives. We are very pleased with today's program and grateful that you all have registered for the webinar and are joining us today. The aim of this webinar is to raise awareness and encourage engagement on the need for improved fish welfare, both nationally in Sweden, but also at EU level. Except for the first point on the agenda, the webinar will be held in English. It will be recorded and made available afterwards for anyone who is interested in watching or rewatching it. There will be time for questions at the end of the program, so please type your questions to the Q&A section and we'll try to include as many as possible. So let's get started. First on the agenda is a dialogue about fish in Swedish politics. So I'd like to welcome Sofia Skönnbrink from the Social Democratic Party and Andrea Andersson from the Left Party. And now we are switching to Swedish for a bit. So välkomna Sofia och Andrea. Kul att ha er med. Jag tänker att ni kan få börja att berätta lite om er själva och om era roller. Sofia, du kan börja och sen passa till Andrea.
Ja, tack för ordet och hej på er allihop. Kul att vara här idag och prata lite fisk. Känns som att det får alldeles för lite utrymme i den politiska diskussionen, i alla fall djurvälfärdsfrågor i den landbaserade odlingen. Jag heter Sofia Skönnbrink och är 34 år, kommer ifrån västra Värmland, ifrån Koppom, en jätteliten ort mellan Charlottenberg och Årjäng. Och är då riksdagsledamot för Socialdemokraterna i Värmland sedan 2022. Jag är i grunden utbildad djurskyddsinspektör, vilket gör det här extra kul. Men jobbade innan riksdagen som miljö- och hälsoskyddsinspektör i Eda kommun. Och nu då i riksdagen så sitter jag i miljö- och jordbruksutskottet tillsammans med Andrea. Och där har jag då ansvaret för djurskyddsfrågor och livsmedelsfrågor för den socialdemokratiska riksdagsgruppen. Så jag tänker att jag stannar där och lämnar ordet till Andrea.
Ja, hej. Jättekul att vara med här. Jag heter Andrea Andersson och jag är också riksdagsledamot och för Vänsterpartiet och miljöpolitisk talesperson. Och i den rollen så ingår att jag bland annat är ansvarig för fiske och vattenbruksfrågor och jag är invald från Stockholm och jag är miljövetare.
Tack. Då tänker jag att vi kan fortsätta med att ni får måla upp en bild för oss. Hur är det att sitta i riksdagens miljö- och jordbruksutskott? Diskuteras djurskydd för fiskar eller är det bara fokus på fiske? Och vilka fiskrelaterade frågor får mest utrymme? Sofia, du kan ta täten igen och passa vidare.
Ja, som jag sa här inledningsvis så tycker jag att vi behöver prata mycket mer om djurvälfärd överlag. Vi är ändå ganska bra på det i Sverige och vi försöker också få resten av EU att komma ikapp vårt land och vår relativt starka djurskyddslagstiftning. Vad gäller fisket då så pratar vi allra mest om Östersjön skulle jag säga, både hemma i Sverige men också nere i EU-parlamentet. Och då handlar det mycket om det storskaliga fisket. Och där har ju vi socialdemokrater drivit länge att vi vill se ett stopp för den storskaliga trålningen för fiskfoder, alltså fiskmjöl som blir till fiskfoder. Och vi vill ju att mer del av den fisk som tas upp då går till humankonsumtion. Så det är den största fiskfrågan som diskuteras just nu, men också då ålfisket är ju något som vi har haft upp ett flertal gånger. Men nej, och sitta i miljö- och jordbruksutskottet tycker jag är jätteroligt, särskilt eftersom jag får jobba med mina största intressefrågor. Men Jag skulle säga att det är mest fokus på just storskaligt fiske och hur vi kan minska påverkan på Östersjön som redan idag har det väldigt tufft. Och där vi ser att många arter kämpar, inte minst då skarpsillen, sillen och strömmingen, beroende på vart längs kusten man befinner sig. Men landbaserad fiskodling tror jag kanske kommer komma upp mer nu framöver, eftersom vi ser att det kommer till större etableringar i landet då. Så den frågan blir ju spännande att följa framöver.
Ja, men jag håller med Sofia. Alltså, jag skulle säga att bland de frågorna som vi jobbar med i miljö- och jordbruksutskottet så är kanske fiskefrågorna ett av de områden som har varit mest omdiskuterade under den här mandatperioden. Men precis som Sofia säger så är det ju framförallt situationen för de vilda fiskbestånden och framförallt i Östersjön som vi har pratat om då, och problemen med det storskaliga industrifisket. Och precis som Socialdemokraterna så vill ju även vi stoppa det storskaliga industrifisket i Östersjön. Det är ju en fråga som också hänger ihop med fiskuppfödningen, eftersom den här strömmingen som fiskas i Östersjön går ju till största delen till att producera fiskmjöl som till stor del används som foder i laxuppfödning. Så att frågorna är ju sammankopplade, men vi har ju inte diskuterat det här utifrån ett djurskyddsperspektiv under de åren som jag har varit med, även om djurskyddsfrågorna också kommer upp i andra sammanhang och det finns ändå ganska bred enighet ofta i de frågorna, åtminstone gentemot andra EU-länder, så skulle jag säga att de är ganska åtskilda ändå. Och det finns ju också, har ju varit också en hel del diskussioner de senaste åren om att man vill utöka vattenbruket i Sverige, och det har skett olika regellättnader kring vattenbruket och då bland annat fiskuppfödning. Men i de sammanhangen så har vi ju inte heller pratat om djurskyddsaspekterna. Så att tyvärr så är det frågor som saknas, tycker jag.
Jag kan bara också lägga till det, Matilda, att precis som Andrea säger så får inte just djurvälfärdsfrågor kopplat till fiskodling något som helst utrymme. Jag upplever väl kanske att man blir lite förlöjligad när man väljer att lyfta det. Ni hade ju ett jätteintressant seminarium i början av mandatperioden som jag var på som ny ledamot. Och efter det så försökte jag ändå liksom lyfta det här och driva på lite grann. Inte minst kopplat till slakten då. Men det är ju det här med relationsetiken, att man kanske värderar kor och grisars liv högre än vad man gör för till exempel kyckling och fisk. Så ju längre ner på skalan man kommer, desto mindre intressant blir det politiskt. Så där tänker jag att vi som är engagerade i djurvälfärdsfrågor får liksom ligga på. För alla djur som vi har i vår omsorg har vi ett ansvar för att skydda mot onödigt lidande och att de ska ha det så bra som möjligt. Och det tycker jag ändå är bra att vi i Sverige faktiskt har lagstiftning för fisk. Även om det säkert finns saker som behöver uppdateras när man liksom utökar den här typen av djurhållning. Så där finns det nog ett jobb att göra. Dels att börja prata om det mer, men också uppdatera djurskyddsföreskrifter och annat då. Så det bevakar vi.
Mm. Fint att höra att ni delar den bilden. Då tänker jag att ni får presentera vad är era partiers främsta prioriteringar på området. Om vi börjar med Andrea och Vänsterpartiet.
Men den frågan som vi framförallt har tagit upp så här långt handlar ju om bedövning med koldioxid inom fiskuppfödning, som vi ser som ett stort problem. Att det har ju dömts ut av forskare som en plågsam och dåligt fungerande metod, så vi tycker att det bör fasas ut. Och vi vill att Jordbruksverket får i uppdrag att ta fram föreskrifter om slakt av uppfödda fiskar där man då förbjuder koldioxidbedövning som metod. Men vi tror att det kommer att krävas en period på några år för att fasa ut den metoden. Så det har vi tagit upp i våra riksdagsmotioner. Sen så när det gäller fiskuppfödning generellt så tycker vi av miljöskäl att det är att föredra att använda slutna tankar på land. Men vi är också väl medvetna om att det följer med en hel del olika djurskyddsproblem med det här. Och för oss är det ju centralt att oavsett vilken metod man använder för fiskuppfödning, precis som med all annan djuruppfödning, så är det viktigt att man följer reglerna i djurskyddslagstiftningen. Så där tycker vi absolut att man skulle behöva se över regelverken för att skärpa reglerna också när det gäller fiskar, så att intentionerna i djurskyddslagstiftningen verkligen följs också när det gäller fiskar. Och sen så, som jag var inne på tidigare, vi tycker ju inte att den här produktionen av fiskmjöl som vi har idag, där vi fiskar ut Östersjön och använder vilda fiskar till att mata uppfödda fiskar med, det kan inte fortsätta på det sättet som det gör nu, och det kommer ju också innebära då förändringar för fiskuppfödning. Och sen om man ska se lite bredare på livsmedelssystemet, så tycker ju vi att man behöver satsa mer på växtbaserad mat då, som alternativ till olika typer av djuruppfödning som vi vet har väldigt stora problem för, dels när det gäller djurskyddet, men också av miljöskäl, klimat och biologisk mångfald och så vidare. Så att vi vill att man ska stärka offentliga stöd för att främja produktion och förädling av växtbaserade livsmedel så att det kan växa. Så det är några saker som vi har tagit upp.
Tack. Då bollar jag till Sofia och Socialdemokraterna.
Ja, men jag skulle också säga att den viktigaste just enskilde för fisken är ju samma sak som Andrea lyfter, att vi också vill se, kanske inte att vi har lika hårda skrivningar om att vi vill se ett förbud mot koldioxid, men däremot så har ju vi tagit ställning kring att vi behöver se mer forskning på alternativa metoder, alltså bedövningsmetoder, och då gäller det ju för alla djur då, där man använder koldioxid, så det blir ju både gris och fågel och fisk då, eller ja, på fågel blir det de här elektrifierade baden då. Men just att man behöver ha mer forskning och liksom kolla på hur man får till andra alternativ, för det finns ju inte jättemånga idag, och de som är tillgängliga blir ju väldigt mycket dyrare, vilket då gör att man hamnar i diskussionen kring betalningsförmåga inte minst, men också betalningsvilja hos konsumenter om priset på mat går upp. För nu ser vi ju redan hur priserna skenar igen då, med tanke på allt som händer mellan USA och Iran och Hormuzsundet och hämmade transporter och så vidare. Men jag skulle säga att vi har fått in den skrivningen i vår kommittémotion är jätteviktig. Sen kopplat till också det här med fiskmjöl och fiskfoder som ju krävs då för att föda upp fisk, så vill vi gärna se mer innovativa lösningar också, hur man kan ta tillvara på restprodukter, inte minst då i redan befintliga anläggningar. Och det vet jag ju att man på Maritimt Center i Simrishamn kollar på hur man ska kunna ta tillvara på slaktrester för att sedan då kunna göra fiskfoder så att det blir mer ett cirkulärt tänk, vilket jag tror skulle vara jättebra. Och sen kopplat till djurskyddskontrollen då, så vet vi att den är extremt eftersatt, och apropå det jag sa om hur man ser på olika djurslag och vilka som är prioriterade, så ser vi redan idag att man inte ens klarar av att utföra tillräcklig djurskyddskontroll för våra livsmedelsproducerande djur. Vi har ju inte nått 10% mål på väldigt många år. Så där har ju vi satt en extra pott pengar, 10 miljoner, inte kanske låter så jättemycket, men det är ändå en viktig symbolisk markering att vi behöver prioritera djurskyddskontrollen då, inte minst mot livsmedelsproducerande djur. Och det tänker jag också att fisken ingår. Men vi behöver få upp frekvensen, att man kommer ut oftare från Länsstyrelsen och klarar av sitt kontrollansvar då. Så det var de delar skulle jag säga som vi har i dagsläget. Förutom då, om vi pratar om den landbaserade och inte den vilda fisken då.
Tack. Vad har ni som avslutande fråga, vad har ni för förhoppningar eller förväntningar för nästa mandatperiod, och vad tror ni kan vara realistiskt att nå?
Jag tänkte att Andrea skulle få komma in eftersom jag precis hade avslutat, men jag kan väl köra på då. Men först och främst så vill vi ju vinna val, både jag och Andrea, så att vi får till ett regeringsskifte. Så att vi kan kanske jobba lite mer framåtsyftande igen. Jag tänker att vi båda våra partier och alla på vänsterkanten är ju rörande överens om att vi behöver hålla i det här starka djurskyddet. Ni vet ju nu under den här mandatperioden som har gått så har vi fört en kamp för betesrätten till exempel för svenska mjölkkor. Så vi ser ju lite grann det här att man snarare backar än liksom vidareutvecklar den redan befintliga lagstiftning som vi har. Så det där kommer vi fortsätta med också då, tänker jag, gentemot EU, att vi försöker få resten av EU-länderna att komma ikapp Sverige till den här grundläggande nivån som vi faktiskt har då. Men det är ju valvinst först och sen såklart så vill vi ju, jag tycker det vore jättebra personligen, hoppas att jag har partiet med mig på det, men att göra en grundlig översyn av alla förordningar och föreskrifter, eller förordningen och alla tillhörande föreskrifter, eftersom vi tog djurskyddslagen 2018, men det finns säkert många justeringar som behöver göras för att det ska liksom samspela på ett bra sätt då. Så det är väl en förhoppning jag ser, och att man också då går vidare och forskar mer på just alternativa metoder vid slakt och bedövning vid slakt.
Nej, men jag håller med Sofia, och jag tänker om man ska prata specifikt om fiskuppfödning, så eftersom det är en fråga som vi inte har pratat så mycket om och som kanske den inte får så stor uppmärksamhet och kanske inte heller tas på tillräckligt stort allvar, så tänker jag att eran rapport som ni ska presentera här nu, det är ett väldigt bra avstamp också för att ha mer diskussioner om det här, och det är bra att det blir mer belyst. Så att jag hoppas att vi kan fortsätta sätta ljuset på de frågorna också, att det blir en större medvetenhet om just de här problemen just nu också, när det är så mycket diskussioner om vattenbruk och att det ska utökas och så är det ju väldigt viktigt att ta tag i de här frågorna också innan vi får en väldigt storskalig utbyggnad som sker på fel sätt. Så det är väl en förhoppning också, att det kan bli mer fokus på just det här.
Tack, det får bli de sista orden. Tack så mycket Sofia och Andrea. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear about your work in the Swedish Parliament, and unfortunately Sofia and Andrea can't stay for the Q&A session because they need to be in the chamber shortly for a vote, so good luck with that. And now let's move on to the next item on today's agenda. Dr. Helen Lambert is a freelance animal welfare scientist and founder of Animal Welfare Consultancy. She works with charities, governments, and corporations globally to improve animal welfare across a range of issues, including wildlife trade and farm animal welfare. Her work spans topics from policy and trade to animal sentience, supported by an extensive publication record. Helen Lambert recently had a literature review published on fish welfare at slaughter in collaboration with Albin Gräns and Linn Snedden, among others, who are based at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences and at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Helen is also the lead author of a scientific review due to be published shortly on fish welfare in RAS farming. And that's what her presentation will focus on today. So the floor is now yours, Helen.
Okay, everyone see that okay? Great. I'm going to, you'll all disappear in a moment, so do shout if something odd happens. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. This is a really important and increasingly important subject, so I'm always pleased to talk about it, because it's one of those things that we need to start thinking about where it's going, what we need to be mindful of, and of course thinking about the welfare of animals involved. So yes, I do have a review paper on recirculating aquaculture systems, hopefully to be published soon. So today I'm going to talk to you about some of the sort of key findings around that, and just to sort of introduce some of the challenges and the sort of the unanswered questions that we have about these systems. Okay, so recirculating aquaculture systems, or RAS, what are they? Well, they're fish farming systems that continuously clean and reuse water rather than relying on a constant flow of new water like you'd see with flow-through systems. Depending on the design, these systems can recirculate anywhere from around 70% to more than 99% of the water used. So this allows fish production in locations where traditional aquaculture may not be feasible, and it also reduces dependence on large volumes of freshwater. Now, RAS can range from relatively simple outdoor systems to highly intensive indoor facilities. However, they all share the same defining feature, which is that water is treated and recycled rather than discharged after a single use. So to understand why these systems are attracting so much attention, it's perhaps useful to look at sort of what a typical RAS facility consists of. This diagram shows the basic principles of a typical recirculating aquaculture system. The fish are kept in tanks where feed is added and of course waste is produced. But rather than discharging the water, it's continuously treated and recirculated. The first step is using mechanical filtration that removes solid waste such as feces and uneaten feed. The water then passes through biological filtration. This is where microbial communities convert the toxic waste products such as ammonia into less harmful compounds. There may be also additional treatment stages such as carbon dioxide stripping, ozone treatment, protein skimming, UV disinfection, oxygenation and water chemistry adjustments. Lots of processes happen before the water is then returned back to the fish tanks. So the result is a highly engineered production system. It gives operators much greater control over the aquatic environment compared with conventional aquaculture systems. And this high degree of environmental control is, of course, one of the main reasons RAS has been promoted as a solution to many of the challenges facing aquaculture today. So although recirculation technology itself is not necessarily new, interest in RAS has increased dramatically over the last decade. Historically, most systems were used for hatcheries and juvenile production, as the value of the fish justified the higher costs of operating a recirculating system. What's changing now is the scale and ambition of these facilities. So in the last decade alone, more than $5 billion have been invested in over 150 RAS projects globally, with annual investment now estimated to exceed $1 billion per year. So it's no longer a niche technology, it's becoming a significant part of the aquaculture sector. Perhaps the best known example is the salmon industry. Traditionally, salmon farming has obviously relied on sea pens, but RAS now allows producers to rear smolts and post-smolts for longer periods and on land under tightly controlled conditions. Some companies are even attempting to produce salmon entirely on land from hatchery through to harvest. However, salmon are just one of the species. In Europe, rainbow trout has historically been one of the most important RAS species, accounting for quite a substantial proportion of production. But increasingly, we're starting to see sea bass, sea bream, tilapia, catfish, sturgeon, pike perch also being reared in these systems. And the shrimp sector is another really critical part of growth. China alone, several large companies have invested in enormous RAS facilities with a combined production capacity of tens of thousands of tons of shrimp per year. So this rather rapid expansion in RAS has been driven by several factors. As I've already alluded to, RAS uses less water. It can be located closer to consumers. It offers producers greater control over environmental conditions, and it's often also promoted as a solution to biosecurity, sustainability, and climate-related challenges facing aquaculture. So as a result, RAS is increasingly being presented as the future of aquaculture. But alongside these sort of questions about productivity and sustainability, we need to ask another key question. What does this mean for the welfare of the fish living in these systems? At first glance, it may seem reasonable to assume that having that greater environmental control should automatically lead to better welfare. After all, if we can control water quality to such a degree, the temperature, the oxygen levels, and of course biosecurity, we can deal with many of the challenges that are associated with traditional aquaculture. However, welfare is about more than controlling environmental conditions. It's about how animals actually experience their lives. And so the key question is whether the additional control that RAS provides genuinely improves welfare, or whether it simply replaces some welfare challenges with different ones. So to explore that question, I'd like to first consider what we mean about welfare and how it can be assessed. So we need to think of a framework for assessing welfare. And for this presentation, I'm going to use the 5 domains model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's one of the most widely used frameworks for understanding animal welfare. The model considers 4 physical and functional domains, so nutrition, environment, health, and behavioural interactions. And together, these influence the animal's overall mental state. And this includes their experiences such as comfort, fear, pain, stress, frustration, or pleasure. Importantly, the 5 domains moves beyond simply asking whether animals survive or remain productive. It focuses instead on what the animal is likely experiencing. Now, this is really important for fish who have been generally neglected, and we sort of focus on mortality levels and very much sort of health indicators and sort of whether they can reproduce, whether they can survive. But a fish may grow well, they may avoid disease, and it may remain alive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are experiencing good welfare. So if we're using this framework, I'm going to sort of not in a sort of a linear order, but look at exploring the major welfare opportunities and challenges associated with RAS and sort of picking on some of these, all fall within these domains. But before discussing these welfare challenges, it's important to sort of come out and acknowledge that there are potential benefits that these systems can offer. Perhaps the greatest advantage is this ability to exert a much higher level of environmental control that you can do with conventional systems. So water quality, oxygen levels, temperature, and other parameters can be monitored and adjusted with considerable precision. Now, this level of control can help reduce exposure to some environmental stresses for the fish, and it may create more stable conditions for them. RAS can offer biosecurity advantages because fish are physically separated from their surrounding environment. There's potentially a greater opportunity to reduce their exposure to some pathogens, parasites, and of course predators. So in theory, these benefits should contribute to improved welfare outcomes. However, whether the benefits are realised in practice depends heavily on system design, management, and stocking densities. So the key point here is that RAS has the potential to improve welfare, but those improvements cannot be assumed simply because the technology offers greater control. And there are, of course, as we'll explore, some greater concerns as well. So one of the most important welfare questions surrounding RAS is intensification. RAS facilities are very expensive to build and operate. They require substantial infrastructure, continuous pumping, filtration, oxygenation, and monitoring. All of these contribute to high operating costs, and there is considerable startup costs as well. So as a result, commercial RAS systems are often designed around high production efficiency. High stocking densities are not simply possible in these systems, they are often fundamental to their economic viability. So, for example, industry reports have suggested stocking densities of around 50 to 80 kilograms per cubic metre are considered as cost effective for land-based salmon production. Now, compare this with approximately 15 to 25 kilograms per cubic metre for a marine farm. So you simply need to have a higher stocking density for these systems to be profitable. Now, at first glance, this may not seem problematic because, of course, with RAS, the main purpose of that is to maintain water quality, and we know how important water quality is to manage around stocking density. However, increasing the number of animals in the system places increasing pressure on the system. So more fish require more feed, they generate more waste, they consume more oxygen, and of course they place greater demands on the filtration and treatment systems. This creates a fundamental challenge, and the very factor that helps make RAS economically viable, so the high stocking density, is also the factor that makes maintaining that optimal environmental conditions more difficult. Reports from the Norwegian Veterinary Institute have also highlighted ongoing concerns regarding welfare incidents in hatcheries and RAS facilities, particularly focusing on where operators are managing fish at high biomass levels. They're finding the number of reported welfare incidents increasing in recent years, so prompting concerns around the industry's ability to consistently maintain these optimal conditions as production intensifies. Now, furthermore, the high stocking densities that come almost inherent in these systems have other implications for fish welfare, including behavioural restriction, competition, as well as many other factors. I'll go into the behaviour a bit later on, but it's important to note that scientific understanding of the true impact of high stocking densities on fish is not fully understood. So once again, we come back to this idea that welfare is about more than just survival. A fish may be able to survive in a high stocking density, but it doesn't mean that they have good mental welfare and that they're actually living a good life. So many of the welfare concerns I'll discuss in this presentation can be traced back directly or indirectly to this challenge around intensification. So as I've already mentioned, one of the main selling points of RAS is this ability to control the environmental conditions to quite a high degree. So unlike an open system, operators can actively regulate the oxygen levels, the temperature, the water quality. And in theory, this should allow fish to be maintained under these stable and predictable conditions throughout the production system. However, achieving that stability requires a highly engineered environment, and RAS depends on a complex network of pumps, filters, biofilters, oxygenation systems, sensors, and treatment technologies. They all need to work together continuously. As the water is being constantly recirculated, cleaned, and oxygenated, it also needs to be monitored to maintain these suitable conditions. This is far removed from a system relying on a river, a lake, or a coastal environment. So instead of depending on natural processes, which I will admit can be very challenging as well, fish become dependent on technological processes. So this creates a different type of vulnerability, as maintaining the water quality is not a one-off task. It's a continuous balancing act that involves oxygen demand, waste removal, flow rates, filtration efficiency, and all sorts of water chemistry. These water quality challenges are particularly relevant to highly recirculated systems and those with particularly high stocking densities. So, for example, hydrogen sulfide can accumulate within parts of the system and become highly toxic to fish if the concentrations are allowed to increase. As stocking densities increase, operators often rely also more on their oxygenation systems to meet the fish's oxygen demands. While this helps to maintain the oxygen levels, it can also increase the risk of gas supersaturation, creating additional welfare risks. So it's a real balance. The key point again is that RAS does not remove environmental challenges, it transforms them. Environmental conditions become more controllable, but welfare becomes increasingly dependent on technology, system design and management. And this dependency becomes particularly important when we consider what happens when these systems fail. So the examples shown on this slide, just a small selection of reported incidents from some recent years. They help to illustrate the consequences when these highly controlled systems experience major failures. For example, one Norwegian facility experienced the collapse of a production unit that resulted in the deaths of approximately 50,000 fish. In Canada, the failure of a carbon dioxide filtration system led to the death of around 100,000 Atlantic salmon. And in Florida, filtration issues contributed to the loss of approximately 500,000 salmon. So some incidents have involved water quality problems rather than mechanical failures. As I've already alluded to, water quality can be challenging. In one Danish pilot facility, a human error resulted in stagnant water entering the system. This caused dangerously high nitrogen levels and resulted in the death of around 227,000 salmon. Some other incidents demonstrate how sort of what you think would be external factors can interact with these highly controlled environments to cause problems. At one facility, around 200,000 salmon had to be harvested early as there were problems associated with noise and vibration from nearby construction works. In another case, a fire destroyed an entire facility and killed approximately 300,000 fish. Now, I'm not presenting these examples as being representative of every RAS facility, nor are these incidents unique to RAS. Similar failures in different forms can occur in other aquaculture systems. However, I'm bringing them here because they highlight an important point. The same technological complexity that allows operators to exert that greater control over the fish's environment can also create situations where failures can affect very large numbers of fish simultaneously. So from a welfare perspective, these incidents are important, not simply because the fish die, but because many of these events are likely to involve prolonged periods of respiratory distress, poor water quality, physiological stress or disease before mortality occurs. So in other words, those fish are suffering. Death is not instantaneous, they are suffering for the period prior to death. They also raise an important question. If these catastrophic failures receive media attention, what about the more routine welfare challenges that may occur when systems are functioning largely as intended? These are the sort of the newsworthy ones. So to explore that, I'd like to look beyond these sort of major incidents and consider the day-to-day health implications associated with RAS environments. So even when we don't have catastrophic failures, there are still concerns with RAS systems, and the RAS environment can still influence fish health in a variety of ways. Like I've already said, there are benefits and there are challenges as well. Some of the challenges tend to begin with water quality. So this benefit of RAS to be able to regulate the environmental condition is contingent on the fact that the water is continuously reused. The contaminants and waste products can accumulate if there's any issues with the filtration, the water exchange or system management. Studies have shown that elevated levels of contaminants such as nitrate can affect fish health from very early stages. Research on carp larvae, for example, found reduced growth, poorer survival and developmental effects when fish were exposed to water with high contaminant accumulation. Similar findings have been reported with rainbow trout, where elevated nitrate concentrations associated with altered behaviour, reduced growth and lower survival rates. So when things go wrong with managing these systems, which we say they can happen on a catastrophic level or they can happen on a more chronic lower level, the fish can develop some considerable health issues as a result. Water flow and velocity also play a really important role. Appropriate flow rates are needed to maintain water quality, distribute oxygen and remove waste efficiently. Studies have shown inadequate flow rates can increase the prevalence of lesions, impair growth and contribute to poorer overall health outcomes. However, increasing the flow rate also increases energy demand. So producers are left with, remember these are very expensive systems, so producers often have to make trade-offs between welfare and costs. Adequate velocity is also needed to provide optimal swimming conditions for fish and also to keep the waste suspended so it can be effectively transported to the filtration units. This can be quite hard to manage with high densities, as the actual increase in biomass, the more bodies there are in the water, disrupts and reduces this velocity. Velocity is really important for salmonids. They show poor growth and health if they can't perform their sustained aerobic swimming. But if the velocity is too high, this may increase physiological stress, cause physical damage, such as skin and fin damage. And so it's a real balancing act with these parameters that producers have to tackle. Several studies have also reported elevated cortisol levels in fish, so the stress hormone, reported in fish that are reared under more intensive conditions, particularly at higher stocking densities. Cortisol is often referred to as this primary stress hormone in fish, and if it's elevated for a long period, can have implications for their immunity, growth, and overall health. The effects may also be visible in the fish themselves. Research comparing fish reared in RAS with flow-through systems has identified differences in skin structure, including thinner epidermal layers and altered mucosal responses in those fish reared in the RAS compared with flow-through. So while the interpretation of these findings remains debated, there may indicate that fish are responding to environmental challenges within the system, and we simply haven't understood what they are yet. Similarly, skeletal development may also be affected. Some studies have reported reduced vertebral mineralization in RAS-reared fish. This raises concerns around their long-term robustness and how susceptible they are to developing deformities. Some studies have identified differences not only in physical characteristics, such as skin structure and skeletal development, but also in patterns of gene expression between fish reared in RAS and flow-through systems. So this suggests that the rearing environment may influence biological development at a deeper level than is immediately apparent. Again, I allude to the questions that we just haven't answered yet. Gill health represents another really important area of concern. Gills are in constant contact with the surrounding water, of course. They're particularly sensitive to environmental conditions, and studies have reported higher levels of gill pathologies in some RAS populations. Things like inflammation, tissue changes, reduced respiratory efficiency. It's important to note that findings are not entirely consistent. Research in this is still really early days, given the growth of the sector. So outcomes do appear to be highly dependent on management practices and environmental conditions. Not all RAS are the same. One of the recurring themes throughout the literature is also that many of these effects develop gradually over time. So unlike the catastrophic failures I discussed previously, they may not, some of these more gradual concerns may not result in immediate mortality, but may instead affect the growth, the robustness, the fish's disease, susceptibility to disease, and their resilience throughout their lives. Importantly, these factors don't tend to occur in isolation. So water quality, stocking density, stress and disease risk, they all interact with one another. So it can be really difficult to identify a single cause of poor welfare outcomes. And so welfare in these fish is often shaped by the cumulative effects of multiple environmental pressures. So overall, these studies suggest that health outcomes in RAS are closely linked to environmental management. Good or poor welfare is not achieved simply because water is recirculated. It's not as simple as that. It depends on maintaining environmental conditions that support healthy physiological development throughout the life of the fish. Now, biosecurity is another purported benefit around RAS, one of the major advantages. Fish are physically separated from their surrounding environment, so exposure to some external pathogens, parasites and predators can be reduced or even eliminated. One of the most frequently cited benefits is the reduced risk of parasite infestations, particularly those that can spread from wild populations. And this has the potential to improve welfare and reduce reliance on treatments that may themselves have welfare implications. However, it doesn't mean that the disease is necessarily eliminated. Pathogens can still enter facilities through fish being brought in, feed, water, equipment, personnel. The closed nature of RAS can reduce opportunities for pathogen introduction, but once pathogens become established within a recirculating system, they can be particularly difficult to eradicate. Because water, equipment and fish are interconnected, management often focuses on controlling pathogen levels rather than eliminating them entirely. Now, this highlights a bit of a recurring theme throughout the RAS literature. So while the systems may reduce exposure to some external disease threats, they can create conditions that favour other health challenges. Fungal infections, for example, have emerged. They're a particular concern in some RAS operations. In several cases, there's been fungal outbreaks that have resulted in substantial mortalities and economic losses, demonstrating that improved biosecurity does not necessarily equate to freedom from disease. Another issue receiving increasing attention is the presence of so-called pipefish. Pipefish are fish that escape from the production tanks and then survive within the pipework. Their biofilters might be in pump sumps or various components of the system. Because they're not routinely monitored, they may act as reservoirs of pathogens and potentially can contribute to disease persistence between production cycles. So a producer may think they've eradicated the disease with a batch, but then the pipefish may be acting as a reservoir that continues to the next batch. These pipefish also raise an unusual welfare concern. These fish effectively exist outside the normal production system, which means they're not routinely observed, they're not counted or cared for, yet they may survive for quite long periods, and they may exist in dark and highly artificial parts of the facility. They may be exposed to a range of welfare risks. They may incur injury, especially as they grow in a smaller area, poor nutrition, disease and chronic stress, and all of this will go undetected. So overall, RAS appears capable of reducing some biosecurity risks, particularly those associated with the external environment, such as predators. As soon as you move the fish indoors, that's a big, easy win there. However, rather than eliminating disease threats, RAS may change the nature of those threats and shift where the greatest risks occur. So in many respects, the challenge is not whether disease can be prevented, but which disease becomes more important within these highly controlled environments. So up to this point, I focus mainly on health, disease, mortality and environmental conditions. They're all important aspects of welfare, but they're not the whole picture. The behavioural interactions domain, if you think back to the 5 domains model, this domain asks a different question. It's about what the fish are actually able to do. In other words, does the environment allow the fish to express behaviours that are important to them? Does it allow the fish to have meaningful control over their environment? It's an important distinction because good welfare is not simply about the absence of disease. An animal can, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again, an animal can be physically healthy and still experience poor welfare if they're prevented performing behaviours that are strongly motivated or biologically important. So for fish, these behaviours may include swimming, exploring, foraging, interacting with conspecifics, avoiding perceived threats, and for some species, migrating. This is really relevant when we consider RAS. These systems can provide highly controlled environments, but they're often characterised by high stocking densities, which means limited space for each individual and relatively simple environments. So as a result, questions arise about not only whether the fish survive and grow, but also about how they're able to behave. So the next 3 examples move beyond physical health and consider welfare from the perspective of the fish's behavioural opportunities and restrictions. And ultimately, this leads us to the broader question of what does a good life look for a fish in aquaculture? So one way of improving welfare is to provide animals with opportunities to interact with and respond to their environment. This is often referred to as environmental enrichment, and it can include structures, substrates, shelters, variation in tank design, or other features that encourage exploration and species-typical behaviours. None of this could I capture in a picture, so I've got an aquarium on playing with a toy. This is not an aquaculture system, but it illustrated my point. The good news with RAS is that enrichment can be successfully used. They're enclosed systems, so enrichment won't be washed away by currents, and in principle it could be incorporated into system design. Research shown it can be quite straightforward, as fish often display preferences for particular environmental conditions. So, for example, studies that have looked at tank and substrate colours have found that some species exhibit lower stress levels when they're housed in tanks with a certain colour or substrates with a certain colour. So these relatively simple modifications can influence how fish experience their surroundings. However, despite the potential, most commercial RAS remain relatively barren. One reason for this is practicality. The high stocking densities I mentioned as almost inherent in these systems leave limited space for additional structures, and operators then will have concerns about cleaning them, maintenance, biosecurity, waste accumulation, that sort of thing. So another challenge is also that enrichment is not universally straightforward. Different species have different behavioural needs, and poorly designed enrichment can cause more problems than it's worth. It can cause competition, aggression, injury, all these sorts of things. So there's a lot of work needs to go in to make sure we have the right enrichment for the right species, but the facility needs to support this. So there's no single enrichment strategy that can be applied across all RAS systems or all farms fish species. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be exploring this though. One of the most important things from my perspective around the enrichment research that's been conducted in aquaculture, as it's all around sort of reducing negative outcomes. And this is a real problem with fish, is that we still really in our infancy in terms of improving welfare for them. We're still very much sort of caught up with how to make life a little bit less bad. So looking at reducing negative outcomes like stress, aggression or injury, the example I mentioned earlier around tank colours, was around reducing stress. Far less attention has been given to whether enrichment can be used to promote positive experiences such as exploration, curiosity or play. And this is really important because, and I'll say it again, welfare is not simply about preventing suffering, it's about creating opportunities for animals to experience positive states. So environmental enrichment does represent a really promising opportunity for improving fish welfare in RAS, and its application in commercial systems is vital, but very limited. And our understanding of what constitutes a genuinely positive experience in this regard is still in its infancy, so that does not help matters. So migration. I mentioned migration earlier for some species a very important behaviour. It provides an interesting example of how behavioural welfare questions can be really difficult to answer. For many species, migration is not simply movement from one place to another. It's a highly evolved behavioural strategy that's linked to feeding, reproduction, predator avoidance and life history. Salmon are perhaps the best known example, as wild salmon will undertake remarkable migrations. They'll travel between freshwater and marine environments as part of their natural life cycle. These journeys involve substantial physiological and behavioural changes and are among the most distinctive features of the species. Farm salmon, including those reared in RAS, obviously do not have the opportunity to perform these migrations. Instead, they spend their lives within highly controlled environments that are designed around production rather than movement. So the important welfare question here is whether preventing migration matters to the fish. Interestingly, evidence suggests that farm salmon may retain some of these biological mechanisms and motivations associated with migration that haven't been bred out. Some individuals would continue to display behaviours consistent with migratory tendencies despite being raised and bred in captivity. Despite the importance of migration in the natural biology of these species, very little research has directly investigated the welfare implications of preventing fish from migrating. So it creates an interesting contrast with terrestrial animal welfare. If we prevented a bird from flying or a grazing animal from moving across pasture, as we do with zero grazing systems and dairy cows, those questions start to be raised about behavioural restriction. It's something we're really much more familiar with terrestrial farmed animals. For fish, these equivalent questions have really scientifically received far less attention. Now, migration isn't unique to wrasse. Fish in sea pens and other aquaculture systems are also unable to undertake natural migrations. But this issue highlights a broader challenge for fish welfare science. How do we assess the welfare implications of preventing behaviours that may still be highly motivated but are really difficult to measure? We simply do not know whether restricting migration has little effect on welfare or whether it represents one of the most significant behavioural restrictions experienced by some farm fish species. That uncertainty alone highlights an important knowledge gap in our understanding of fish welfare. I say wrasse and beyond, of course. Now, going back more specifically to wrasse, one of the strongest welfare concerns identified in the literature relates to depuration and the prolonged feed withdrawal that often accompanies it. Unlike many conventional aquaculture systems, fish produced in wrasse can accumulate these compounds that are responsible for earthy or musty off flavours. While these compounds don't necessarily affect the safety of the product, they can make the product less appealing to consumers. So to remove these off flavours, fish are commonly transferred to these systems, these depuration systems before slaughter. Now, during this period, feed is typically withdrawn for around 1 to 2 weeks. They want to clean the water by sort of removing any food from the water and from the fish. Now, this 1 to 2 weeks, 7 to 14 days, is obviously a lot longer than the 24 to 72 hour feed withdrawal period that's commonly used before slaughter in other aquaculture systems. Some researchers will argue that fish can physiologically tolerate these periods without food, and certain species will naturally experience seasonal fluctuations in food availability. And studies have shown that fish can cope metabolically with short-term starvation. However, tolerance and welfare are not necessarily the same thing. An animal may be capable of surviving a particular challenge without physiological harm. Does not mean the animal, the experience is neutral in terms of a welfare perspective. So this distinction becomes particularly important when we consider what opportunities fish have for positive experiences in aquaculture systems as well. So in many commercial systems, feeding may represent one of the most meaningful and rewarding events in the day. If fish are housed in relatively barren environments with limited behavioural opportunities, removing food for extended periods may also remove one of the few potentially positive experiences available to them. There's also evidence suggesting that welfare impacts, there are welfare impacts associated with feed withdrawal. As I say, the research is a little bit conflicting in parts, but studies have reported poorer body condition, increased fin erosion, and longer-term behavioural changes in fish following extended periods without food. What makes this issue particularly interesting is how little we know. Despite the widespread use, very few studies have directly investigated the psychological experience of fish during these periods. This means that one of the most common management practices associated with wrasse may also be one of the least understood from a welfare perspective. There is encouraging news as there are alternatives beginning to emerge, and some studies have suggested it may be possible to continue feeding fish while still reducing the off-flavour compounds. If successful, these approaches could potentially improve both production outcomes and welfare. So big win-win. But ultimately, this highlights a broader point. Welfare assessment shouldn't focus solely on whether fish survive a management procedure, but also look at whether fish may be experiencing, what fish may be experiencing while this practice occurs. So when discussing fish welfare, noise and vibration are often overlooked. So for fish, sound is a really important part of how they perceive and interact with their environment. Unlike terrestrial animals, fish do not only detect sound pressure, they're also highly sensitive to particle motion and vibration, allowing them to detect movements and disturbances in the surrounding water. This distinction is important because fish may experience sound very differently from humans. While we think of noise as something we hear, fish may also experience vibrations travelling through the water and surrounding structures. In effect, they can be exposed to both acoustic and mechanical disturbances simultaneously. This is really important in wrasse because these systems contain a huge range of equipment that operate continuously. Much of this equipment is physically connected to the tanks and the pipework. So these vibrations can be transmitted directly through the system. Together, these factors can create an environment that is acoustically very different from the habitats in which these species have evolved. Studies have reported that noise levels within some aquaculture systems are substantially higher than those found in natural environments, and research has also shown that exposure to elevated noise can affect behaviour, increase physiological stress responses, and negatively affect feeding and growth. Several studies have shown some examples of these effects. So, for example, in juvenile largemouth bass reared in wrasse, playback of operational equipment noise altered their swimming behaviour and adversely affected indicators associated with antioxidant and immune function compared with control fish. Research has also highlighted the importance of low frequency noise and vibration, which is again really relevant in wrasse due to the pumps and water movement and the vibration transmitted through the floors and walls. Some of these studies have found that low frequency sounds can have an even greater impact on growth physiology and feeding behaviour than high frequency sounds, partly because they fall within the range that fish are most sensitive to. So the vibration component is particularly important, as fish can be exposed to mechanical vibrations have also shown to exhibit changes in blood parameters indicative of physiological stress, suggesting that they may be responding not only to sound itself, but also to physical disturbances transmitted through their environment. Another really interesting consideration is predictability. So some evidence suggests unpredictable soundscapes may be more disruptive than predictable ones. In this respect, wrasse may have both advantages and disadvantages. The systems can be noisy, much of the sound is relatively constant and predictable though. So the fish may adapt to it. But fish in open systems may be exposed to a wider range of intermittent and unpredictable disturbances, such as vessel traffic, construction activity, and weather-related events. So one challenge is that fish simply can't switch off their exposure to these stimuli. In highly stocked systems, opportunities to move away from noise sources or vibrations may be really limited. Studies of Atlantic salmon have found that immediate changes in swimming behaviour following unexpected environmental disturbances, suggesting that fish are really sensitive to changes that occur within their surroundings. So the welfare implications of chronic noise are really poorly understood, as you see a theme occurring here. Short-term responses have been documented, but far less is known about the consequences of living in noisy and vibrationally complex environments throughout the production cycle. These effects may also interact with other welfare challenges, such as stocking density, behavioural restriction, environmental stressors. We know that if an animal is already stressed by something else, their resilience to cope with something else is worse. So it all has a cumulative impact on welfare. Ultimately, I'm aware of the time, sorry, I'll wrap up. Noise and vibration highlight another important point about wrasse, and creating a controlled environment is not simply about maintaining water quality and oxygen levels. So just to put this up again, to just say that we've talked about the different domains and how all these feed into the mental states. Speed up a little bit. The final domain, the 5 domains, is the mental states, and in many ways the most important, because it's the reason animal welfare matters in the first place. When we talk about welfare, we're ultimately talking about what an animal experiences. Scientific evidence has advanced considerably over the last few decades, and there's widespread recognition fish are sentient animals capable of experiencing pain and stress and fear, potentially also positive states such as reward, exploration and play. So instead of asking whether fish survive, we should be asking what they experience. Instead of asking whether fish grow, we should be asking about what that growth process is like for them. Instead of asking whether a production system is efficient, we need to ask what kind of life it provides for the animals living within it. So the challenge is that we cannot directly ask a fish how they feel. Instead, we must draw upon evidence from their behaviour, their physiology, their cognition, neuroscience, all of this to make informed perspectives on how they're coping with their environment. We do know less about positive welfare than we do about negative welfare, and actually what this looks like for fish and aquaculture systems is really lacking. We need to consider what constitutes a life worth living for fish, or more critically, from my perspective, a good life. A life worth living is the very low bar we should not be aiming for. There are increasingly important questions such as these as aquaculture expands globally and production systems become more technologically advanced. Ultimately, we recognise fish as sentient beings, so this means their welfare assessments can't stop at survival, productivity or health. We need to consider the experiences of the fish themselves and whether the systems we create allow them the opportunity for a good quality of life. So I've already highlighted all these throughout. There's lots of knowledge gaps. I mentioned the gap in positive welfare in farm fish, the mental experiences in RAS and widespread, the welfare implications of migration restriction, the limits of intensive stocking densities, and not just looking at the production outputs, the actual welfare outcomes beyond their sort of health and reproductivity. Welfare, the effects of long-term effects of noise and vibration, and the psychological effects of feed withdrawal. And of course, we need standardized welfare indicators for RAS. They're very different systems, so different things need to be put into place. And as innovation continues, ensuring that welfare science develops alongside that technological development is really essential. So if there's a few messages I'd like you to take away, as I rattle through the last bit, I always do this, it takes far longer than I anticipate, but these would be the messages. First, control does not automatically translate into good welfare. RAS provides opportunities to control the environment, but welfare outcomes ultimately depend on how these systems are designed and managed. Secondly, high stocking densities remain one of the most central welfare challenges. The economic viability of many RAS facilities depends on intensive production. This makes it essential to understand where welfare limits lie. Third, welfare challenges are not necessarily eliminated, they might be shifted. For fish welfare is about more than health, survival and productivity. I've said it so many times, but hopefully it's clear. These factors are important, but are ultimately meaningful because of how they influence the experiences of the fish themselves. Positive welfare is number 5, remaining one of the least understood areas of fish welfare science, and we know far more about negative states, even though we don't know enough, but far more than we do about promoting positive experiences. And finally, RAS is expanding rapidly around the world. So as that expansion continues, welfare science must develop alongside that technological innovation to ensure welfare remains a critical and central consideration, rather than an afterthought, as we've seen in other farming sectors. Thank you, and sorry for overrunning.
Thank you so much, Helen. Helen will be staying for the Q&A session, so if you have any questions for her, please post them in the Q&A. Our next speaker is our own Linda Björklund, animal welfare specialist and ethologist at Project 1882. She has been working on animal welfare issues, primarily concerning fish and other aquatic animals, pigs and cattle, for over 20 years. Linda will tell us about the issues and proposed solutions that Project 1882 considers necessary for improved animal welfare for fish and other aquatic animals and for sustainable aquaculture industry. So the floor is yours, Linda.
Thank you, Matilda. And thank you, Helen, for a great presentation. Does it look okay with my screen now? Yes. Yeah. So I will talk about the problems that Project 1882 considers to be absolutely essential to address right now from an animal welfare perspective when it comes to aquaculture, and how we propose these problems to be solved. So first, aquaculture involves the production of both plants and animals in water. And today we're focusing mostly on the animals, and in particular on fish. First of all, why should we care about fish? There are several reasons. First, they are sentient individuals. It's now well established that fish can feel pain and suffer, yet they are still often treated as emotionless objects, and they are still referred to in terms of being grown, at least in Swedish, and harvested as if they were plants. And 2, there are a huge number of them. As fish in the industry and in statistics are counted in tons rather than as individual fish, we do not know exactly how many fish are farmed and slaughtered each year. Globally, the number is estimated at around 124 billion fish per year, which can be compared to about 80 billion chickens, pigs, and other land animals slaughtered worldwide each year. And in addition, there are a huge number of fish caught in commercial fisheries that are used as feed, primarily for fish in aquaculture, and I will come back to that later on. 3, the third reason They are subjected to severe suffering. The way fish are kept and handled, as well as the fish welfare legislation, it's very inadequate from an animal welfare perspective. And 4, they are, at least fish in aquaculture, subject to broader legislation, both at national and EU levels. However, there are significant gaps. The legislation needs to be detailed, species-specific, and strengthened. And this brings us to the important issue of the need for legislation. The very least we should expect when animals are farmed and slaughtered is that animal welfare legislation is in place. Legislation based on the animal's needs and research, which sets minimum standards for how animals can be kept and what they can be subjected to. And that's far from where we are today, especially when it comes to fish and other aquatic animals. At the EU level, a review of the animal welfare legislation is currently ongoing. However, there is no guarantee that fish will be covered by the revised and new legislation being developed, which we believe should be absolutely essential. The most topical EU legislation revision right now is the one on animal welfare at transport. These are some examples of key legislative provisions that are needed regarding transport of fish and other aquatic animals. We want to see delegated acts establishing species-specific technical standards on, for example, water quality and stocking density. And the regulation should apply to all fish and other aquatic animals transported in the context of economic activity, including, for example, ornamental aquatic animals. We want to see requirements on handling, loading, and transport times, fitness for transport criteria, and also a demand on post-transport monitoring with the recording of mortalities and behavior and necessary measures. Legislation on the farming, transport, and slaughter of fish needs to be expanded to include detailed provisions and tailored to the specific species and the various life stages of the fish. Right now, the Swedish Board of Agriculture, they has introduced an updating of the national regulations on fish farming and has an ongoing revision on the regulation on welfare at slaughter. However, it's still unclear when this work will be completed and what it will entail. We expect that the new updated slaughter regulations will include provisions on fish and other aquatic animals' welfare at slaughter, which are missing entirely today. And the proposal is expected to be published this fall after the summer. Sweden and other member states taking steps in the right direction in this area would not only increase welfare national in Sweden, but also increase the likelihood that legislation will be developed at EU level. So it's very important now that Sweden introduces regulations on the welfare and slaughter of fish and other aquatic animals. Just as with legislation on the rest of the fish's life, legislation on slaughter must be species-specific and based on research. In Sweden, the so-called CO2 stunning that was mentioned in the beginning of this webinar in the political dialogue. The so-called CO2 stunning, which should not even be considered a stunning method, many means, of fish is still legal and practiced. We want to see a ban on this method as soon as possible, since it has serious shortcomings, as CO2 causes the fish severe stress and discomfort. And as the method is ineffective, there is a risk that the fish will be subjected to bleeding and gutting while fully conscious, which causes great suffering. Another method of stunning fish at slaughter is with electricity. Electrical methods have long been regarded as effective and beneficial from an animal welfare perspective. However, research has shown that this is not always the case. A serious risk is that the fish appears to be unconscious, when in fact it's just paralyzed. So it's important that the fish loses consciousness quickly, within 1 second, following the stunning method. And the fish must not regain consciousness, as then it would be conscious during the bleeding process. Visually checking whether the fish is conscious or not is not sufficient. The method must be validated by measuring the fish's brain activity. And it's also important that stunning and slaughter equipment, as well as the handling process, are scientifically validated and adapted to the species and the size of the fish. And one challenge is that as the fish is intended for human consumption, the aim is to strike a balance between ensuring that the electrical stunning is powerful enough to achieve an acceptable level of welfare, whilst ensuring that meat quality is not negatively affected. In Sweden, an estimated 5 million fish are farmed and slaughtered each year for human consumption. And the most common species farmed in Sweden is rainbow trout. The second most common species is char. Though Atlantic salmon is the farmed fish species most consumed by Swedes. Sweden is actually one of the countries in the world with the highest salmon consumption per capita. Yet animal welfare shortcomings in salmon farming are serious, and we are seeing an alarming trend with the establishment of RAS farms that we've heard of, just large-scale land-based salmon farms. That is RAS factories. They are being planned and established in response to the growing criticism of the negative environmental impact of salmon factories in the sea. High mortality rates and risk of escapes, for example. They are already found in several countries, while others are planned or in the startup phase here in Sweden. So today, the majority of salmon consumed in Sweden comes from mainly net pen farming in the sea in Norway, and RAS salmon factories are marked as sustainable alternative to traditional salmon farming in sea net pens. Although the truth is that both these systems fall short when it comes to both animal welfare, which is a key aspect of sustainability, and sustainability in a broader sense. And since salmon consumption is so high, both in Sweden and globally, I'd like to say a little bit more about some of the problems associated with the production of salmon. Salmon are kept confined for 2 to 3 years, mainly in net pens or in tanks on land, in conditions that fall far short of meeting their needs. That is a very long time to live in inadequate conditions for an animal. As with other animal species, salmon breeding and rearing also focus on rapid and high growth. At the fry stage, the salmon are exposed to high temperatures and continuous light to accelerate their growth. Rapid growth at this stage has been shown to contribute to the salmon developing abnormal heart shapes, which in turn is associated with disease and impaired heart function later in life. Many salmon die from circulatory failure following handling and stressful procedures. And more than 1/6 of the salmon in Norwegian salmon factories die during the farming. And as Helen also mentioned, we should not only measure mortality, but that's how the reality looks like today. You measure a lot of mortality, but high mortality rates in salmon farming are a result of poor animal welfare. So common causes of the high mortality rates are the consequences of treatment for sea lice, gill disease, and bacterial infections. A common method of trying to combat sea lice is to use so-called cleaner fish, which eat the lice of the salmon. And there are a few species of wrasse that are used as cleaner fish. The problem is that the cleaner fish, they also suffer greatly in the salmon farms, which are not at all suited to their needs. So their welfare is also poor, and a large proportion of the cleaner fish, sometimes as many as 100%, die. Aquaculture at lower trophic levels for greater sustainability. There is considerable political interest in promoting aquaculture, including fish farming. Aquaculture is seen as an industry of the future, generating jobs and growth, and as a vital part of Sweden's food production. There is much discussion about and initiatives on reducing regulatory burdens and increasing production, but initiatives regarding animal welfare legislation and improved welfare are not given the same priority. There is a lack of discussion and guidelines on what kind of aquaculture can truly be considered sustainable and what sustainability entails. Visions, strategies, and action plans for aquaculture exists and are being developed both at EU level and nationally in Sweden. And these programs, they influence, amongst other things, where public funds are allocated in the aquaculture sector. Animal welfare for fish is lagging behind. More knowledge and legislation are needed. Priorities in future visions, programs, strategies, and action plans must reflect these needs. In this slide, you can see a picture from a survey conducted in 2024. And there were residents in 9 EU countries taking part in this survey, and the results show that residents in EU think that public funding for aquaculture should be allocated in a transparent manner, and farms which uphold high animal welfare standards and sustainability standards should be given priority. Globally, around half of all fish consumed comes from fish farms. And one reason for the growth in fish farming is that the oceans are becoming increasingly overfished. However, fish farming also contributes to the overfishing of the oceans, as most farmed fish are fed a diet that is partly made up of wild-caught fish. The issue of feed is often cited as one of the greatest challenges to sustainability in fish farming. Farming fish that are fed on wild-caught fish contributes not only to animal suffering on the fish farm itself, but also to the suffering and death of the fish caught in the wild for use as feed. The numbers and the suffering are huge. Estimates suggest that between 500 billion and 1 trillion fish caught in the wild each year are used for the production of fish meal and fish oil, which corresponds to almost 20% of all wild-caught fish. Demand for raw materials for fish meal and fish oil is very high, and most of it are used for fish feed. Most of the fish caught in Swedish commercial fisheries are used to produce fish meal and fish oil for feed. Approximately 70% of the total catch measured by weight. But the fish used to produce fish meal and fish oil are generally small. So in terms of the number of fish, the percentage is probably even higher. Attempts are currently being made to replace fish meal and fish oil in fish feed. However, this presents a challenge, as the natural diet of a predatory fish do consist of other fish. And insect farming is a growing industry, and one area of application is fish feed. We believe that feeding fish with insect-based feed is the wrong approach to solving the challenges facing global food production. We need fewer animal factory farms, not more. and insects are sentient beings. We should not lock ourselves into systems that depend on more and new factory farms. We are missing, and we want to encourage a discussion and a clear stance on the importance of moving away from the farming of species that are dependent on animal feed in favor of the farming of plants and herbivorous species. The strategic guidelines for a more sustainable and competitive aquaculture sector in the EU for the period 2021 to 2030 state that diversification towards species at lower trophic levels, such as algae and herbivorous fish, should be encouraged. It is clear that aquaculture that is to be considered sustainable cannot include the farming of predatory fish, as for example salmon. Support for food production needs to underpin the transition to a more plant-based diet rather than, as is currently the case, favoring animal farming and feed production. Octopus, that is cephalopods, are not fish, but I want to mention them anyway. They are aquatic animals, and there are plans to launch the first commercial cephalopod factory farm in Spain. We believe that these factories must be stopped through legislation before they are established. Cephalopods are solitary animals with highly complex behavior, and the farming environments do not meet their needs. So a ban is needed in Sweden and at EU level. In conclusion, Project 1882, this is the measures necessary to strengthen fish and other aquatic animal welfare. We need animal protection legislation, animal welfare legislation for fish and other aquatic animals in Sweden and at EU level. For slaughter, including a ban on CO2 stunning. We need legislation on transport and species-specific legislation also on the farming, covering the whole life of the animals. A ban on farming of predatory fish and a ban on cephalopod farming. We want to see an end to financial support for and the establishment of RAS factories, consideration of animal welfare in all vision strategies and action plans concerning aquaculture and fisheries, and a strategy for the transition to a sustainable food system with focus on plant-based. And for more information and also for references to my presentation, please read our new report, Aquaculture Necessary Priorities for the Animals, and you can find it in our webpage, or you can send me an email and I'll send the report for you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Linda. Now there is some time for questions. So the first question from Carmen to Helen. Can disease outbreaks in the tanks due to a number of failures have an impact on humans?
So that's one benefit of these RAS systems, that they are enclosed systems. So you don't have like you would in a sea pen, for example, these disease outbreaks going out into the ocean and affecting wild populations. So in theory, no. Providing all good biosecurity measures taking place, so that these systems still have staff coming and going, as long as they're taking the right precautions. And when the fish go into depuration, there is a complete change of water. So how all of those things are managed, and the whole idea that these are supposed to be recirculating the water and reducing water use, comes a little bit unpicked when they're completely removed from all that water is removed and they're going to a fresh depuration tank. So there are potential implications, but in theory that is one of the ways in which it could be better than some of the other systems which could leach into the ocean and so on.
Perfect. We have one question from Anders to you, Helen. It's quite long, but let's try. Thanks for a good review. Some short questions. Some report an increase in early maturation in RAS possible due to accumulation of hormone? If so, would that have an influence on the migration issue? Also heard from colleagues in Norway that it is difficult to get rapid growth in salmon beyond 2.5 kilos in intensive RAS. Finally, from other colleagues, I have indications that fish exposed to continuous maximum growth has heart and circulatory issues, similar to that we see in fowl. Have you some information or comments to the above?
So yeah, let me try to unpick the three. So I'll start with the last one first. Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as we mess with the natural biology of animals, and as soon as we try to make animals grow faster in smaller space, intensify production, we end up with problems. It's a well-known fact, and fish are no exception to that. In the same way we have with poultry, as soon as you put those pressures and try to make them grow faster in unnatural environments, you will have those health problems. So yeah, so I alluded to some of the genetic changes, the skeletal changes. It's looking, research is really early, but it's looking like RAS produces quite weak animals, aren't resilient, and more likely to have deformities and so on. And yeah, and heart and cardiac and respiratory factors are part of that as well. In terms of, yeah, so you've got the trade-off between stocking density and growth, absolutely. So because they are so expensive, they want to get as many fish as you can in there. There comes a point, because on a production level, that will, if growth is impaired, that will prevent high stocking densities. But my call is obviously for the welfare implications. Even if you can get those salmon to grow at a rate you want them to grow at a higher stocking density, what are the other welfare implications? And yes, in terms of the migratory question, there is so much unknown, but absolutely hormonal change could have an impact. It's one of those things, people are buried their heads in the sand because they're like, oh, well, you can't really produce salmon and let them migrate. So we just won't address that. And it's been one of the many things that haven't been explored.
Thank you. And I noticed one more question from Carmen that we can take now. How outspread is RAS? Are there RAS systems in Sweden?
I'm not familiar with Sweden particularly, but Linda might be able to answer on that. But certainly it's growing. So even in China, they're now bringing huge ones with shrimp in. There are sort of pockets globally. Norway's a big one. UK has some. It's starting to build and growing before our eyes. I'm not so my knowledge of Sweden's infrastructure is lacking, but yeah, certainly it is growing globally.
Perfect. Let's try with at least one more question. We have one from Helena to you, Helen. Thanks for the high density presentation regarding the different developmental phases of Atlantic salmon, and that hindering migration behavior must be a welfare issue. Could they be slaughtered before they want to migrate, or are they too small?
Yes. So yeah, there is it's those trade-offs with production and in profits and so on, and the best interest of the animals. We don't know at what point the fish actually starts to think about migration, start to have those feelings, start to prepare. So if you think about how we think long term in advance, what point do those instincts start to come in? There might be preparatory behaviors we just simply don't know, because we just don't know enough about fish. So potentially those we could be removed. Obviously for breeding animals that's not going to be the case. They would still need to go past that point, but yes, but again, regardless, the implication about not knowing enough about the fish, so it would be a concern for sure.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, it's time to wrap up today's webinar. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the content, both as speakers and as participants. And if we weren't able to answer your question during this Q&A session, or if you think of a question later, you can always feel free to send us an email afterwards. This webinar will be uploaded and available to watch later on our YouTube channel, so keep an eye out there and please share it with others who might be interested. And as Linda mentioned, we will continue to highlight the importance of fish welfare both in Sweden and at the EU level. And since it's election year in Sweden, we will work to bring this issue to the forefront and hope that the coming legislative term will bring significant progress in this area. And if you're planning to visit Almedalen this year, be sure to stop by. And if not, I hope to see you soon in other contexts. And finally, we hope that you share this vision and that you've taken something away from today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.